The morning sun climbed over the volcanic ridges of Okinawa, but Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto could not see it. He sat in the corner of a concrete bunker, his hands trembling, waiting for the Americans to arrive. He had calculated the trajectory of their advance, estimated their artillery range, analyzed the probable axis of their assault, and reached an inescapable conclusion. Today, April 23rd, 1945, would be his last day alive. The engineering manuals spread before him, filled with bridge specifications and fortification diagrams, would soon be ashes. More importantly, he would soon be dead, not from battle, but from what came after. The propaganda officer's words echoed in his mind, delivered in that theatrical baritone just 3 weeks earlier. The Americans torture their prisoners. They cut off fingers one by one. They burn men alive for sport. Better to die with honor than endure such shame. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Takeshi had believed every word. Why wouldn't he? He had seen the photographs. Grainy images passed around the barracks showing mutilated bodies, American soldiers posing with skulls, the casual cruelty of an enemy that treated Japanese soldiers as less than human. He had read the official reports detailing systematic torture of prisoners. He had memorized the Field Service Code, which stated explicitly that capture meant death anyway, so why suffer the indignity? The grenade resting beside his left boot represented his contingency plan. One motion, one explosion, and he would spare himself the horror of American captivity. His family would be told he died honorably. The shame of surrender would die with him in this bunker. But what Takeshi did not know, what he could not have known, was that within 72 hours, his entire understanding of the war, his enemy and his own government, would collapse like one of the unstable bridge designs he had rejected in engineering school. The food that would be placed before him would exceed anything he had eaten in the past 2 years of military service. The Americans would not cut off his fingers. They would not burn him. They would not torture him for information. Instead, they would feed him nearly 3,000 calories a day, provide him with medical care superior to what Japanese officers received, and treat him in a manner so contrary to everything he had been taught that he would spend the first week in a state of cognitive dissonance so severe he would barely be able to eat. This is the story of how propaganda met reality, how indoctrination collided with evidence, and how one man's expectation of execution transformed into an experience so unexpected that it would haunt him for the rest of his life, not because of what was done to him, but because of what was done for him. The year 1945 represented the final convulsion of the Pacific War. By April, American forces had established a foothold on Okinawa, the last major stepping stone before the Japanese home islands. The battle would eventually claim over 12,000 American lives and upward of 100,000 Japanese military and civilian casualties. For the Japanese defenders, this was Armageddon in slow motion. Every day brought more artillery, more flamethrowers, more terror from the sky. And for engineers like Takeshi, every day brought the maddening task of building fortifications that would inevitably fall, constructing defenses that would be obliterated, calculating fields of fire that would prove insufficient against American firepower. Takeshi Yamamoto had not always been a soldier. 6 years earlier, in 1939, he had been a promising student at Tokyo Imperial University, specializing in civil engineering. His designs for suspension bridges had earned praise from his professors. His thesis on stress distribution in multi-span structures had been published in an academic journal. He had dreams of building the infrastructure of a modern Japan, roads, bridges, dams that would last centuries. Then came the draft notice in 1942, and those dreams evaporated like morning dew. The Imperial Japanese Army needed engineers, but not for building. They needed them for destroying, or rather, for fortifying positions that would ultimately be destroyed. Takeshi's first assignment had been in Manchuria, where he supervised the construction of defensive positions along supply routes. The work was technically interesting, but professionally soul-crushing. He was designing structures meant to withstand bombardment, not serve future generations. His bridges were tactical, not enduring. His calculations served death, not life. The transformation from student to soldier had been thorough. The Army systematically stripped away his civilian identity and reconstructed him as a component of the imperial war machine. Morning exercises began at 5 o'clock, followed by political indoctrination sessions that emphasized the sacred duty of defending the emperor. The instructors spoke of Japan's divine destiny, of the racial superiority that made Japanese soldiers spiritually superior to the materialistic Americans. They showed films of American atrocities, some real, many fabricated, to kindle hatred in the conscripts' hearts. But it was the specific propaganda about prisoner treatment that burrowed deepest into Takeshi's psyche. During one particularly memorable session in January of 1944, an intelligence officer had given a presentation titled "The American Enemy: Understanding Their Barbarism." The officer, who claimed to have interviewed soldiers who had escaped American captivity, described in lurid detail how prisoners were subjected to systematic torture. Water was forced down their throats until their stomachs distended. Bamboo shoots were driven under their fingernails. They were paraded naked through villages while civilians threw stones. Some, the officer claimed, were dissected while still alive, their organs studied by American medical personnel, who viewed Japanese prisoners as experimental subjects rather than human beings. "The Americans see you as animals," the officer had said, his voice rising to a crescendo. "They collect your bones as souvenirs. They make letter openers from your femurs. To them, you are not men but insects to be studied, tortured, and ultimately exterminated. This is why the Field Service Code forbids surrender. Not merely because surrender is shameful, though it is, but because surrender means certain death after prolonged suffering. Better a clean death in battle than degradation in enemy hands." Takeshi had believed these words completely. Why would an intelligence officer lie? The evidence seemed overwhelming. Photographs of skulls in American barracks, affidavits from the few prisoners who had allegedly escaped, official reports from the Imperial General Staff. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. American propaganda about humane treatment was a tactical lie designed to induce surrender. The Geneva Convention was a Western fiction that Americans honored only when it served their purposes. The reality, Takeshi had been taught, was brutality masked by hypocritical claims of civilization. This indoctrination was reinforced by the broader context of Japanese military culture. The Senjin-kun, or Field Service Code, issued in January of 1941, had been explicit. Never live to experience shame as a prisoner. This was not merely advice, but a moral imperative woven into the fabric of Japanese military identity. To surrender was not simply a tactical decision, but a spiritual collapse, a betrayal of ancestors, emperor, and nation. It represented the loss of one's humanity, the forfeiture of all rights and dignity. The cultural roots of this attitude ran deep. The samurai tradition emphasized death before dishonor, and while most Japanese soldiers were not samurai descendants, the mythology had been weaponized by military propagandists. School textbooks glorified soldiers who had chosen death over capture. Newspapers published accounts of officers who had committed ritual suicide rather than face the shame of defeat. Radio broadcasts featured emotional readings of farewell poems left by pilots who had flown kamikaze missions. The entire society had been mobilized to celebrate death and despise survival. For Takeshi, this created an impossible psychological bind. His engineering training had taught him to think probabilistically, to calculate odds, to make rational decisions based on evidence. But his military indoctrination had instilled the belief that capture was worse than death, that torture was inevitable, that survival as a prisoner meant betraying everything he had been raised to honor. The rational calculation suggested that if capture was imminent, the grenade offered the only honorable exit. The propaganda had made certain of that. By April of 1945, the strategic situation on Okinawa had become hopeless. American forces had landed on April 1st and were systematically grinding through Japanese defensive positions. Takeshi's unit had been tasked with maintaining the fortifications around Shuri Castle, a medieval structure that had become a key defensive position. He spent his days repairing damaged bunkers, reinforcing trenches, and calculating the remaining structural integrity of positions that came under daily bombardment. The rations had become increasingly meager. In peacetime, Japanese soldiers had received approximately 4,000 calories daily, generous portions of rice mixed with barley to prevent beriberi, canned meat and fish, vegetables and condiments. The pre-war Japanese military had actually fed its soldiers quite well, understanding that nutrition was essential to combat effectiveness. But by 1945, the logistics system had collapsed under the weight of American submarine warfare and strategic bombing. Supply ships were being sunk before they could reach Okinawa. The warehouses were empty. The gardens that soldiers had planted to supplement their rations had been destroyed by artillery. Takeshi's current daily ration consisted of approximately 600 grams of rice, often moldy, and watery soup made from daikon radish tops. If he was lucky, there might be a small piece of dried fish or a few soybeans. The total caloric value was perhaps 1,500 to 1,600 calories, barely sufficient to maintain basic metabolic function, let alone support the physical demands of combat engineering. He had lost weight steadily over the past 6 months. His uniform, which had fit properly when issued, now hung loosely on his frame. His ribs were visible. His face had hollowed. When he looked in the small mirror he kept in his pack, he barely recognized himself. The hunger was constant, gnawing, maddening. It affected his ability to concentrate, his physical strength, his emotional resilience. He dreamed of food, of the meals his mother had prepared when he was a student, of the restaurant dinners he had enjoyed during leave in Tokyo, of the simplest pleasures like fresh rice with pickled vegetables. But dreams only intensified the hunger. The reality was malnutrition bordering on starvation, and every soldier in his unit shared the same gaunt desperation. The propaganda officer's lectures had taken on a darkly ironic quality. He continued to assure the men that they were spiritually superior to the materialistic Americans, that their suffering proved their moral worth, that the emperor appreciated their sacrifice. But the officer himself looked well fed, his cheeks still full, his uniform still fitting properly. The enlisted men whispered that the officers received larger rations, that the food shortage affected ranks unequally. Takeshi did not know if these whispers were true, but he noticed that the propaganda about spiritual superiority intensified as the physical rations diminished. It was as if moral exhortation was meant to substitute for calories. On April the 22nd, 1945, the situation deteriorated catastrophically. American forces had broken through the defensive line north of Shuri, and enemy troops were advancing rapidly. Takeshi's commanding officer, Captain Nakamura, assembled the engineering detachment and delivered what amounted to a final briefing. The captain's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the knowledge that they were all about to die. "The Americans will reach our position by tomorrow morning," Nakamura said. "We have orders to hold this position and deny them passage. There will be no withdrawal. Every man will fight to the last. If you are wounded and cannot fight, you know your duty. Do not allow yourself to be captured. The enemy shows no mercy to prisoners. Death in battle is honorable. Capture is eternal shame." Takeshi had nodded along with the other men, but later, alone in his bunker with his engineering manuals and his calculations, he felt the weight of the captain's words. Tomorrow he would die, either in battle, which seemed unlikely given his non-combatant status, or by his own hand to avoid capture. The grenade beside his boot represented his plan. When the Americans breached the bunker, he would pull the pin. 4.2 seconds later, the problem would be solved. He spent that night writing a final letter to his parents. He knew they would never receive it. The postal system had long since collapsed, but the ritual provided some comfort. He wrote about his love for them, his regret that he would not survive to care for them in their old age, his hope that they would understand he had died honorably. He did not mention the fear that coiled in his stomach like barbed wire. He did not mention the doubt that had begun to creep into his thoughts. He did not mention that part of him wondered if the propaganda had been entirely true. But that doubt was heresy, and he pushed it away. The Americans were coming. He would die rather than face what they would do to him. This was certain. This was inevitable. This was his duty, except it wasn't. The Americans arrived at dawn on April 23rd, just as Captain Nakamura had predicted. But they did not arrive as Takeshi had imagined. There were no hordes of barbaric soldiers eager to torture prisoners. There were no trucks equipped with torture devices. Instead, there was methodical, overwhelming force. Flamethrowers that cleared bunkers, tanks that crushed fortifications, coordinated infantry that moved with practiced efficiency. The Japanese defensive position collapsed in less than 2 hours. Takeshi had been in the rear bunker, ostensibly working on structural calculations, but actually paralyzed by fear. He heard the explosions drawing closer, the distinctive crack of American rifles, the screams of wounded men. He heard Captain Nakamura shouting orders, then silence. He heard boots on the ground above his bunker. He reached for the grenade. His hand closed around it. His thumb found the pin. One motion, and it would be over. One motion, and he would avoid the torture, the degradation, the shame. One motion, and he would die honorably. But his hand would not move. He sat there frozen, the grenade clenched in his fist, while Boots approached the bunker entrance. Sunlight flooded in. A voice shouted in English, words he did not understand. More voices. The beam of a flashlight swept the interior of the bunker. "We got one! He's alive!" Takeshi understood the tone, if not the words. He had been spotted. This was the moment. Pull the pin, end it. But his body refused to obey. Some deep, primal survival instinct had paralyzed his hand. He could not release the pin. He could not throw the grenade. He could only sit there trembling as American soldiers entered the bunker with their rifles pointed at him. One of them, a young private with an Iowa accent that Takeshi would later come to recognize, saw the grenade and shouted, "Grenade! He's got a grenade!" But instead of shooting immediately, another soldier, older, a sergeant with 3 stripes on his sleeve, raised his hand. "Wait! Just wait! Look at him! He's terrified." The sergeant approached slowly, his rifle lowered but ready. He said something in English, his tone surprisingly gentle. Takeshi did not understand the words, but the tone was not what he expected. Where was the hatred? Where was the eager anticipation of torture? The sergeant extended his hand, palm up, in a universal gesture. "Give me the grenade, son. Just hand it over. Nobody's going to hurt you." Takeshi stared at the hand. His military training screamed that this was a trick, that the moment he surrendered the grenade he would be beaten, tortured, killed. But the sergeant's face showed no malice, only a strange combination of alertness and what appeared to be concern. Slowly, mechanically, Takeshi extended his hand and placed the grenade in the sergeant's palm. The sergeant carefully secured the pin and pocketed the grenade. Then he pulled out a canteen and offered it to Takeshi. Water. Clean water. Takeshi's throat was parched from fear and days of inadequate hydration. He drank, expecting the water to be drugged or poisoned, but it was just water. Cool, clean water that soothed his throat and began to clear his mind. Within minutes, Takeshi had been zip-tied, gently, without unnecessary force, and led out of the bunker. He expected to be beaten. He was not beaten. He expected to be paraded before jeering soldiers. Instead, he was loaded onto a truck with other prisoners, all of them staring at each other with the same expression of confused terror. They were driven to a temporary processing center where they underwent medical screening. A medic examined Takeshi's emaciated condition, noted his malnutrition in a logbook, and marked him for immediate nutritional support. "This one's severely malnourished," the medic said to a colleague. "Probably hasn't had a decent meal in months. Get him to the mess as soon as processing is complete." Takeshi did not understand the English, but he understood the tone. It was not cruel. It was not mocking. It was clinical, professional, tinged with what sounded like concern. This did not match what he had been told. This did not match his expectations at all. The interrogation came next, and this was the moment Takeshi truly expected the torture to begin. He was led into a tent where an American officer sat behind a folding table, accompanied by a Japanese-American translator. The officer was perhaps 40 years old, with tired eyes and the bearing of someone who had seen too much combat. The translator was younger, speaking Japanese with an American accent but perfect grammar. "Name and rank," the translator said in Japanese. Takeshi considered refusing to answer. The field service code stipulated that prisoners should give only name, rank, and serial number. But he also knew that refusing to cooperate would trigger the torture he had been warned about. He provided the requested information. "What was your unit's strength?" "I cannot answer that." The officer said something in English. The translator nodded and said, "That's fine. You don't have to answer anything you don't want to. We're just trying to get a sense of the situation. Were you receiving adequate food and supplies?" This question caught Takeshi off guard. Why would the enemy care about his food situation? Was this a trick? He remained silent. The officer studied him for a moment, then said something to the translator, who smiled slightly. "He says you look half-starved, and he's going to make sure you get fed, whether you answer questions or not. The war is over for you. You're safe now." Safe. The word seemed to come from a different language entirely. How could he be safe? He was a prisoner of the Americans, the enemy who tortured and killed prisoners. Except that so far, they had not tortured him. They had not killed him. They had given him water and were promising him food. This cognitive dissonance was so severe that Takeshi felt dizzy. The interrogation continued for perhaps 30 minutes, with the officer asking questions that Takeshi mostly declined to answer. But unlike the torture scenarios he had been warned about, there were no consequences for his refusal. The officer did not become angry. No one threatened him. No implements of torture appeared. Instead, the officer eventually stood, said something to the translator, and left the tent. "You'll be transferred to a permanent POW camp tomorrow," the translator said. For now, you'll be held with the other prisoners. You'll be fed and given medical attention if you need it. Do you have any injuries?" Takeshi shook his head. The translator studied him with an expression that seemed almost sympathetic. "You were told we would torture you, weren't you? That's what they told all of you. It's not true. We follow the Geneva Convention. You'll be treated humanely." Takeshi did not believe him. This was clearly part of the psychological torture. Lull the prisoner into a false sense of security, then spring the trap. He would remain vigilant. He would not let his guard down. The torture would come. It was only a matter of time. But first, they took him to the mess hall. This was where Takeshi's worldview began its irrevocable collapse. The temporary prisoner holding area included a mess facility, essentially a large tent with folding tables and a field kitchen. As Takeshi and approximately 40 other Japanese POWs were led into this tent, the smell hit him first. Cooked meat. Real meat, not the tiny scraps of dried fish he had been subsisting on. Bread. Fresh bread with a yeasty aroma that made his stomach clench with desperate hunger. Vegetables. He could smell onions, potatoes, something else he could not identify. The prisoners were formed into a line. Each man was given a metal tray. Then, in a process that seemed surreal, American cooks began serving food onto these trays. Takeshi watched the man ahead of him receive his portion and nearly gasped. The tray contained a substantial portion of stew with actual chunks of meat, 2 slices of bread with butter, a serving of cooked vegetables, and a cup of what appeared to be coffee. When Takeshi reached the front of the line, a cook, a heavy-set corporal with a Brooklyn accent, ladled stew onto his tray, added the bread, vegetables, and coffee, and said something in English with a tone that sounded like casual friendliness. Takeshi stood there, staring at the tray, unable to process what was happening. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Another prisoner nudged him forward. Takeshi moved to a table and sat down. Around him, the other Japanese prisoners were staring at their food with the same expression of disbelief. Some had already begun eating with desperate hunger. Others, like Takeshi, seemed paralyzed by confusion. Was this a trick? Was the food poisoned? Was this the psychological torture? Give them one good meal before the suffering began? Takeshi picked up the spoon and took a small bite of stew. The flavor exploded in his mouth. Rich, savory, complex. Real meat, beef or pork. He could not tell which, but it was meat with actual fat and flavor. Potatoes that had been cooked with care. Carrots, onions. The broth itself was seasoned with salt and herbs. It was, without exaggeration, the best meal he had eaten in over a year. He ate slowly at first, waiting for the nausea that would signal poison. It did not come. He ate more quickly. His stomach, shrunken from months of inadequate nutrition, protested the sudden influx of rich food. But he could not stop. He ate the entire portion, every drop of stew, both slices of bread, all of the vegetables. He drank the coffee, which was bitter but provided a jolt of warmth and energy he had not felt in months. When he finished, he sat back, breathing heavily, his stomach distended but finally, blessedly full. Around him, the other prisoners were having similar experiences. Some were crying. Whether from relief, confusion, or shame, Takeshi could not tell. One man was vomiting into a bucket, his body rejecting the rich food after months of near starvation. But most were simply eating with the focused intensity of men who had forgotten what it felt like to have enough food. A Japanese-American soldier approached the tables, the same translator from the interrogation. He addressed the prisoners in Japanese. "You've all been malnourished. This meal is probably richer than what your stomachs can handle right now. Try to eat slowly. You'll be fed 3 times a day from now on, so there's no need to gorge yourselves. If you feel sick, use the buckets. If you need medical attention, raise your hand and someone will help you. 3 times a day. The word seemed impossible. The Japanese army had fed its soldiers 3 times daily only in peacetime or in secure rear areas, in combat zones, on isolated islands, in desperate defensive positions like Okinawa. Soldiers were lucky to receive 1 meal of rice and soup. But the Americans were promising 3 meals? This had to be temporary, a show for propaganda purposes. Tomorrow the real treatment would begin. Except tomorrow brought another 3 meals, and the day after that, and the day after that. Takeshi spent the next week in the temporary holding facility as he and other prisoners were processed and prepared for transfer to permanent POW camps. Each day followed a similar pattern. Wake at dawn, breakfast, oatmeal or rice porridge with canned fruit, a brief medical check, lunch, sandwiches or stew with bread. Afternoon processing, more interrogations, paperwork, photographs. Dinner, meat, vegetables, rice or potatoes, and lights out. The portions were substantial. Takeshi estimated he was receiving at least 2,500 calories daily, possibly more. After months of semi-starvation, his body responded dramatically. He gained weight. His strength returned. The mental fog caused by chronic malnutrition began to lift. But perhaps more shocking than the food was the general treatment. There was no torture. There were no beatings. The guards were professional, sometimes even friendly. When prisoners had questions, they received answers. When prisoners were sick, they received medical care. One man developed a severe case of dysentery, and instead of being left to die, he was taken to a field hospital where he received intravenous fluids and antibiotics. He recovered within days. Takeshi observed all of this with growing confusion. Nothing matched what he had been told. The propaganda had prepared him for systematic cruelty, for torture that would make death seem preferable, for treatment so degrading that suicide would be the only honorable option. Instead, he was being fed better than he had eaten in the Japanese military, treated with basic human decency and allowed to live with a level of physical comfort that exceeded his conditions as a Japanese soldier. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Takeshi had built his entire understanding of the war on certain assumptions. The Americans were barbaric enemies who would torture prisoners. The Japanese military was morally superior despite its hardships. Death was preferable to capture. Surrender meant eternal shame. But every one of these assumptions was being contradicted by direct experience. The food was real. The medical care was real. The absence of torture was real. The humane treatment was real. Either the propaganda had been lies, or this was an elaborate psychological operation designed to extract information. Takeshi oscillated between these interpretations, unable to accept either fully. If the propaganda had been lies, then his government had deliberately misled its soldiers, sending them to die under false pretenses. But if this was psychological warfare, it was the most elaborate, resource-intensive deception he could imagine. The Americans were feeding hundreds of prisoners multiple meals daily. They were providing medical care that consumed resources. They were treating POWs better than the Japanese military treated its own soldiers. For what purpose? What information could possibly be worth this investment? The other prisoners grappled with similar questions. In the evenings, after the final meal, the men would huddle in small groups and talk in hushed voices. Some maintained that this treatment was temporary, that the torture would begin once they were transferred to permanent camps. Others argued that the Americans were weak, that their excessive concern for prisoners revealed a moral softness that would ultimately lead to their defeat. A few, mostly older soldiers who had served in China, suggested that perhaps the propaganda had exaggerated certain elements of American behavior. but no one could reconcile the fundamental contradiction. They had been told that capture meant certain death after torture, yet here they were, alive, well-fed, and unmolested. Some of the prisoners coped with this cognitive dissonance by doubling down on their military indoctrination. They insisted that their treatment was a temporary aberration, that they were traitors for allowing themselves to be captured, that they had lost all honor. These men often refused to eat or ate minimally, as if by rejecting the food they could somehow reclaim their dignity. Takeshi found himself in a different category. His engineering training had taught him to update his beliefs based on evidence. The evidence was overwhelming. The propaganda had been false. The Americans were not torturing prisoners. They were not killing POWs. Instead, they were following something they called the Geneva Convention, an international agreement that set standards for POW treatment. Takeshi had never heard of this convention during his military service. The Japanese government had acknowledged its existence but declined to ratify it, and Japanese military education had ignored or dismissed it as Western hypocrisy. But now, experiencing its provisions firsthand, Takeshi realized that the Geneva Convention represented an entirely different philosophy of warfare. It assumed that soldiers from opposing sides were still human beings deserving of basic dignity. It required that POWs be fed, housed, and treated humanely. It prohibited torture, execution, and degrading treatment. It established that surrender was a legitimate tactical decision rather than a moral failure. This was revolutionary to Takeshi. His entire military indoctrination had emphasized that warfare was an existential struggle between incompatible civilizations, that the enemy was fundamentally other, that no mercy could be shown or expected. But the Geneva Convention suggested that warfare could be bounded by mutual agreement, that certain practices could be prohibited even amid total war, that enemies remained human beings with rights that transcended the conflict. On the 7th day of his captivity, Takeshi was transferred to a permanent POW camp in Hawaii. The journey involved a ship crossing, and he half expected this to be when the true treatment would reveal itself. Surely the Americans would not maintain this facade across an ocean transit. But the ship that transported him and several hundred other Japanese POWs was clean, the accommodations adequate, and the food continued to be substantial. 3 meals daily, medical checks, no torture, no cruelty beyond the basic restrictions of confinement. Part 2. The permanent camp and the cost of truth. The POW camp on Oahu sat inland from Pearl Harbor, a collection of barracks surrounded by wire fencing and guard towers. When Takeshi arrived in May of 1945, he expected conditions to deteriorate. Surely the Americans would not maintain the pretense of humane treatment indefinitely. Surely this facility, away from the scrutiny of frontline operations, would reveal the true nature of American captivity. He was wrong again. The camp housed approximately 1,500 Japanese prisoners, organized into companies of about 100 men each. The barracks were simple wooden structures with rows of bunks, but they were dry, reasonably clean, and provided protection from the elements. Each prisoner received a blanket, a pillow, basic toiletries, and 2 changes of clothing. The latrines were crude but functional. There was a washing area with running water. There was even a small infirmary staffed by American medical personnel and Japanese POW orderlies who had received basic medical training. But it was the mess, a hall that continued to defy Takeshi's expectations. On his first morning at the camp, he was awakened at 6 o'clock by a bell. The prisoners formed into lines and marched to the mess hall for breakfast. What he saw there would have seemed like fantasy during his final days on Okinawa. Long tables with benches, American cooks serving from large pots and trays, and food, substantial, varied, nutritious food. The breakfast that morning consisted of oatmeal with brown sugar, canned peaches, 2 slices of toast with butter and jam, scrambled eggs made from powder, and coffee. Takeshi estimated this single meal contained more calories than in many entire days during the Okinawa campaign. He ate slowly, still half expecting someone to snatch the tray away, to reveal that this abundance was a cruel joke. But no one did. The other prisoners ate with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some attacked their meals with desperate hunger. Others, still bound by the shame of surrender, ate mechanically, their faces expressionless. After breakfast, the prisoners were assembled for orientation. An American officer, Captain Henderson, addressed them through a translator. Henderson was perhaps 35 years old, with the weathered appearance of someone who had served throughout the Pacific campaign. He explained the camp rules, the daily schedule, the work assignments that would begin after a brief acclimatization period, and most importantly, the food rations. "You will receive 3 meals daily," the translator conveyed Henderson's words. "Camp supervisors have calculated your caloric needs based on your work assignments. Those not performing physical labor will receive approximately 2,000 calories per day. Those assigned to regular work details will receive 2,500 calories. Those engaged in heavy labor will receive 2,850 calories. These rations will include rice, vegetables, meat, bread, and fruit. You will be fed in accordance with the Geneva Convention standards for prisoners of war. 2,000 calories for non-workers, 2,850 for heavy laborers." Takeshi did the mental calculation. During the Okinawa campaign, he had been performing physically demanding engineering work while subsisting on perhaps 1,500 calories on good days, often less. The Americans were providing their prisoners with nearly double the rations that Japanese soldiers received in combat zones. This seemed impossible. How could an enemy be so generous to prisoners while simultaneously waging total war? The answer lay in something Captain Henderson mentioned almost casually. American forces operate under the principle that proper treatment of enemy prisoners serves multiple purposes. It encourages enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death, reducing casualties on both sides. It maintains the moral standards that distinguish us from totalitarian regimes, and it ensures reciprocal treatment of American prisoners in enemy hands. Reciprocal treatment. The logic was straightforward once explained. If Americans treated Japanese prisoners humanely, perhaps Japan would treat American prisoners humanely. Except Takeshi knew, with growing horror, that this reciprocity had failed completely. The Japanese military had systematically brutalized Allied POWs. The camps throughout the Pacific and Asia where American, British, Dutch, and Australian prisoners were held operated on starvation rations, often 600 to 800 calories daily. Prisoners were beaten routinely. They were worked to death building railways and airfields. They were denied medical care. They died of malnutrition, disease, and abuse in staggering numbers. Takeshi had not participated in these atrocities directly. He had been on combat engineering duty, not prison guard duty. But he had heard stories. Everyone in the military had heard stories. The official position was that Allied prisoners, having surrendered dishonorably, forfeited their rights to humane treatment. The unofficial position, whispered among soldiers, was that the brutality served to demonstrate Japanese superiority and intimidate future enemies. Now, sitting in an American POW camp being promised 2,850 calories for heavy labor, Takeshi began to understand the profound asymmetry of treatment. The Americans fed their enemies. The Japanese starved theirs. Over the following weeks, Takeshi settled into the routine of camp life. After the initial acclimatization period, he was assigned to a work detail maintaining the camp's infrastructure. essentially his pre-war training put to peacetime use. The work was not particularly demanding: repairing buildings, maintaining the water system, ensuring proper drainage during Hawaii's frequent rains. It was almost therapeutic to return to actual engineering rather than military fortification design. He worked 6 hours daily, 6 days per week, with Sundays off. For this labor, he received the 2,500-calorie ration. The food quality remained consistently good by wartime standards. Breakfast typically included some combination of oatmeal or rice porridge, bread or biscuits, canned fruit, eggs when available, and coffee or tea. Lunch was often soup with vegetables and small portions of meat, bread, and occasionally noodles. Dinner featured larger portions, meat stew or roasted meat, substantial servings of rice or potatoes, cooked vegetables, bread, and sometimes dessert, usually canned fruit or occasionally cookies. The American camp supervisors had recognized that Japanese prisoners preferred rice to bread and vegetables to pasta, so the menu was adjusted accordingly. While American soldiers might receive more wheat-based meals, Japanese POWs received larger rice portions and different vegetable preparations. This cultural accommodation amazed Takeshi. The enemy was not merely feeding them adequate calories, they were attempting to provide food that matched Japanese dietary preferences. Why would they do this? What possible military advantage came from ensuring that enemy prisoners enjoyed their meals? The answer, he gradually realized, was that the Americans genuinely believed in the principles they espoused. This was not a propaganda operation. This was not psychological warfare. This was simply how they thought prisoners should be treated. They had codified these beliefs in international law, and they followed that law even when their enemy did not. The moral contrast was devastating to Takeshi's understanding of the war. Beyond the food, the camp provided other surprising amenities. There was a recreation yard where prisoners could exercise, play simple games with improvised equipment, or simply sit in the sun. There was a small library with books in Japanese, mostly classics and educational texts, nothing political or military. Some prisoners had started teaching classes. One man taught English, another mathematics, another calligraphy. The camp administrators encouraged these educational activities, believing they maintained morale and reduced disciplinary problems. Medical care continued to exceed anything Takeshi had experienced in the Japanese military. The camp infirmary treated routine ailments, provided preventive care, and transferred serious cases to a nearby military hospital. When Takeshi developed an infected cut on his hand from a construction accident, he was seen by a medic within an hour. The wound was cleaned and bandaged properly, and he received a tetanus shot. The entire interaction took perhaps 20 minutes. He lost no work time, suffered no permanent damage, and received no punishment for his carelessness. In the Japanese military, minor injuries were often ignored until they became serious problems. Here they were addressed immediately with professional medical care. The psychological impact of this treatment was complex. On one level, Takeshi felt a profound sense of relief. He was alive, adequately fed, not being tortured, and living in conditions that, while certainly restrictive, were more comfortable than his final months as a Japanese soldier. He slept on a real bunk rather than in a foxhole. He ate 3 meals daily rather than subsisting on moldy rice. He was not being shelled by artillery or bombed from the air. The war, for him, was over. But this relief was accompanied by shame, guilt, and cognitive dissonance that gnawed at him constantly. He had been taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. Yet here he was, living comfortably as a prisoner while his comrades continued fighting and dying. He had been taught that the Americans were barbaric enemies, yet they were treating him better than his own military had. He had been taught that death was preferable to captivity, yet captivity had proven to be not merely tolerable, but in many ways superior to his life as a Japanese soldier. This cognitive dissonance affected all the Aishtu prisoners differently. Some, particularly younger conscripts, adapted relatively quickly. They accepted that the propaganda had been false, that the war was lost, that survival was more important than abstract notions of honor. They learned English, participated enthusiastically in camp activities, and tried to make the best of their situation. They were, in some sense, liberated from the oppressive ideology that had governed their military service. Others, particularly career officers and soldiers deeply committed to imperial ideology, could not accept the reality before them. They insisted that their comfortable treatment was temporary, that the torture would eventually begin, that they were traitors for accepting American food and medicine. Some engaged in subtle forms of resistance, refusing to work efficiently, maintaining strict military hierarchy among the prisoners, conducting secret ceremonies to honor the emperor. A few attempted suicide, though the camp administrators had anticipated this and maintained careful watch over potentially suicidal prisoners. Takeshi found himself somewhere in the middle. His engineering background made it impossible to ignore the evidence. The propaganda had been systematically false. The Americans were not torturing prisoners. They were following international law. They were providing food, shelter, and medical care far superior to what Japanese soldiers received. This was simply the factual reality, independent of his feelings about it. But acknowledging this reality meant confronting uncomfortable truths about his own government. If the propaganda about American treatment of prisoners was false, what else had been false? The claims of Japanese military superiority, the assertions that the war was winnable, the insistence that the emperor was divine, the entire ideological structure that had governed Takeshi's life since his conscription began to crumble under the weight of direct experience. He began having conversations with other prisoners, carefully at first, then more openly. One older soldier, a veteran of the China campaign, shared a perspective that Takeshi found illuminating. "I have seen our army's behavior toward Chinese civilians and prisoners," the man said quietly, during a recreation period. "We were told they were subhuman, that they deserved no mercy. We committed acts that I cannot speak of without shame. I justified these acts by believing we were superior, that we were building a new Asian order. But now, seeing how the Americans treat us, with dignity we never showed our enemies, I wonder if we were not the barbarians we claimed to be fighting against." This observation crystallized something Takeshi had been struggling to articulate. The propaganda had prepared him to see the Americans as barbarians, but the reality was precisely the opposite. The systematic cruelty had been Japanese, not American. The disregard for international law had been Japanese, not American. The willingness to treat enemies as subhuman had been Japanese, not American. This inversion of his worldview was psychologically shattering. In late July of 1945, the camp received news of significant developments in the war. The translator conveyed reports of massive aerial bombing campaigns against Japanese cities, the entry of the Soviet Union into the Pacific War, and rumors of a new type of weapon with unprecedented destructive power. The prisoners debated what this meant. Some insisted that Japan would never surrender, that the homeland would be defended to the last citizen. Others, particularly those who had witnessed American industrial capacity and military capability firsthand, believed that surrender was inevitable. On August 15th, the prisoners were assembled for an announcement. Captain Henderson, flanked by translators, delivered the news. Japan had surrendered. The emperor himself had announced the decision via radio broadcast. The war was over. The prisoners stood in stunned silence. Some wept. Some remained expressionless. Some erupted in heated arguments. insisting that this could not be true, that the Emperor would never order surrender, that this was American propaganda. But over the following days, as more details emerged, including the actual text of the Emperor's surrender announcement, the reality became undeniable. Japan had lost. The imperial military had been defeated. Everything they had fought for, everything they had been told was sacred and invincible, had collapsed. For Takeshi, this news was simultaneously devastating and oddly liberating. The war was over. He would eventually go home. He had survived. But he would return to a Japan transformed in ways he could barely imagine. The immediate aftermath of the surrender brought changes to camp life. The work details continued, but the atmosphere shifted. The prisoners were no longer enemy combatants, but simply men waiting to be repatriated. Some American guards became friendlier, sharing cigarettes or showing photographs of their families. The Japanese prisoners, knowing they would eventually return home, began to think about what that return would mean. Would they be welcomed as survivors, or condemned as disgraced prisoners? Would their families accept them or turn them away? Would Japan even be recognizable after the devastation of the war? Takeshi spent the months awaiting repatriation in a state of deep reflection. The food continued to arrive 3 times daily. The medical care remained professional. The treatment stayed humane. He had gained back the weight he had lost on Okinawa, plus additional pounds. His health was better than it had been in years. He had learned basic English from the classes taught by fellow prisoners. He had read books from the camp library, expanding his knowledge beyond military engineering. In a strange way, his time as a POW had been an education. Not the brutal education he had expected, but a profound lesson about the gap between propaganda and reality. One conversation stood out in his memory. In November of 1945, a Japanese-American soldier visited the camp to interview prisoners for a research project on POW treatment. This soldier, Sergeant Tanaka, was a Nisei, second-generation Japanese-American, who had served as a translator throughout the Pacific Campaign. Takeshi asked him a question that had been troubling him for months. Why do the Americans treat us so well? We would not have treated American prisoners this way. We did not treat them this way. So why this generosity toward enemies? Sergeant Tanaka considered the question carefully before answering. It's not generosity, he said. It's principle. Americans believe, or at least claim to believe, that certain rules should govern even in war, that enemies are still human beings, that victory should not require abandoning moral standards. Whether they fully live up to these principles is debatable, but the principles themselves are written into American law and culture. The Geneva Convention isn't just a document. It represents a philosophy that warfare should be bounded by mutual agreement. But we showed you no such respect, Takeshi said. Allied prisoners in Japanese camps died by the thousands. We gave them starvation rations while you give us abundant food. We beat and tortured prisoners while you provide us medical care. This asymmetry. How do you accept it? Sergeant Tanaka's expression hardened. We don't accept it. We document it. We will hold trials for those responsible for war crimes. But we don't abandon our principles simply because your military abandoned theirs. That would make us no different from you. The whole point is to demonstrate that there is a difference between a nation that respects international law and one that does not. This conversation stayed with Takeshi through the remaining months of his captivity. The American treatment of Japanese POWs was not merely tactical or strategic. It was ideological. It represented a fundamental belief system about human rights, international law, and the limits of warfare. Japan had rejected this belief system, had treated the Geneva Convention as Western weakness, had brutalized prisoners in the name of military necessity and racial superiority. The moral difference between the two approaches could not have been clearer. In March of 1946, Takeshi was finally repatriated. He and several hundred other prisoners were loaded onto a ship for the voyage back to Japan. The American authorities provided them with basic supplies, including food for the journey, documentation of their POW status, and medical certificates. As the ship pulled away from Oahu, Takeshi stood at the railing and watched the Hawaiian coastline recede. He was going home, but he was not the same person who had sat in that bunker on Okinawa expecting to die. The Japan he returned to was physically and psychologically devastated. Cities lay in ruins from the bombing campaigns. The economy had collapsed. Millions were homeless and hungry. The occupation forces had begun the process of demilitarization and democratization. The emperor had renounced his divinity. The entire ideological structure that had led Japan into war was being systematically dismantled. Takeshi returned to his family's home in Tokyo, or rather, to the rubble where their home had once stood. His parents had survived the war but had lost everything. They lived in a makeshift shelter among the ruins. When they saw him, their reaction was complex. Joy that he had survived, shame that he had been captured, confusion about what his survival meant. The propaganda about POW treatment had affected civilians as deeply as soldiers. Many Japanese believed that prisoners who returned from American captivity had been brainwashed or had betrayed their nation. "Did they torture you?" his mother asked, her voice trembling. "No," Takeshi answered truthfully. "They fed me better than our army did." His father, a retired school teacher who had taught students to revere the emperor and prepare for honorable death, could not meet his eyes. "You should have died," he said quietly. "Death would have been more honorable than this." This was the cost of truth. Takeshi had learned that the propaganda was false, that the Americans were not barbaric torturers, that international law could govern even in total war. But this knowledge isolated him from a society that still clung to the ideology of the war years. To admit that American treatment had been humane meant admitting that Japanese propaganda had been lies. To acknowledge that he had been well fed as a prisoner meant acknowledging that Japanese military policy had been cruel to both its own soldiers and enemy prisoners. To accept that he had survived while maintaining his dignity meant rejecting the core belief that surrender equaled eternal shame. Over the following months and years, as Japan began its reconstruction, Takeshi observed the gradual transformation of public consciousness. The occupation authorities made efforts to educate Japanese citizens about the realities of the war, including the treatment of prisoners. Films showing liberated Allied POWs, emaciated men who had survived Japanese captivity, were shown in theaters. War crimes trials were conducted, with evidence presented of systematic brutality in Japanese-run camps. The contrast with American POW treatment became undeniable even to those who had believed the wartime propaganda most fervently. Some former soldiers and civilians could not accept this reality and retreated into denial or revisionism. Others, particularly younger Japanese who had suffered under military rule, embraced the new democratic ideals with enthusiasm. Takeshi found himself in a difficult position. He knew the truth from direct experience, but sharing that truth often made him unwelcome in circles of former soldiers who maintained that they had fought honorably for a just cause. He resumed his engineering career in the late 1940s, working on reconstruction projects throughout Japan. The skills he had maintained during his POW work details proved valuable. He designed bridges, roads, and buildings for the new Japan, the Japan that was emerging from the ashes of militarism. But he carried with him the knowledge that he had gained in the most unexpected classroom, an American POW camp, where the food was abundant, the treatment was humane, and the enemy proved to be less barbaric than his own government. In his later years, Takeshi occasionally spoke to students and researchers about his experience. He was always careful, always factual, always measured in his descriptions. He did not glorify American treatment or exaggerate his suffering under Japanese military service. He simply presented the facts. He had been taught that capture meant torture and death, but instead he received adequate food, medical care, and humane treatment. He had believed American propaganda about civilized warfare was hypocrisy, but direct experience proved it was policy. He had expected to die in that bunker on Okinawa, but instead he survived to help rebuild a nation. The irony that haunted him most was this. As a prisoner of the Americans, he had been treated better than as a soldier of Japan. The enemy had fed him generously while his own military starved him. The enemy had provided medical care while his own military denied it. The enemy had preserved his dignity while his own military demanded he sacrifice it. This inversion of expectations, this collision between propaganda and reality, had been more devastating than any physical torture could have been. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.